America's politicians gather for an historic New Year's Eve session to try and agree a budget deal. Belfast car bomb, police say an officer and his family narrowly escaped death. And cosmetic surgery, new calls to ban aggressive sales techniques. While Sydney welcomes in 2013 with a spectacular fireworks display. Welcome back. Well, for the first time in 40 years, politicians in America will work on New Year's Eve to try to thrash out a deal to prevent automatic tax rises and spending cuts coming into effect from tomorrow. If there's no agreement on avoiding what's called the fiscal cliff, it would mean tax increases for people in all bands of income. Low earners in America currently pay income tax of 10%. That'll jump to 15%. High earners will see their taxes jump from 35% to nearly 40%. There will also be, across the board, departmental spending cuts. The defence budget will be the hardest hit, with a 9.4% cut. The combination of the tax hikes and spending cuts would cut America's deficit by $600 billion. But economists are warning that could wipe as much as 4% off America's GDP, which would be bad news for an economy already in a fragile state. Well, joining me in the studio is Ian Harris, Managing Director of Zien, one of London's leading commercial think tanks. Hello to you. Thank you for coming in to talk this through with us. We've, of course, heard this term, the fiscal cliff, on and on over the last few months. But that suggests, doesn't it, that things were quite good and then we're getting very bad. Is that a sensible analogy, or are we going from bad to worse?
Well, I think we are going from bad to worse. And I actually describe it more as a toboggan ride, if I can sort of milk the seasonal analogy. And the difference between, so-called falling off the fiscal cliff and not falling off the fiscal cliff is really just a difference of gradient of this toboggan ride downwards. And I don't wish to underplay it. I mean, if they don't reach any sort of agreement today, that gradient is quite steep, and that does mean that there's a greater risk of falling off the toboggan than there would be if they reach a deal. But I think that some of the terminology being used is quite sensationalistic. Yeah,
financial Armageddon, this kind of talk. But then on the other side of the coin is that we've seen the markets on a downward trend over the last 5 days in the US. There is, of course, the very serious matter of confidence here, isn't there? And
confidence is a really important thing as far as markets are concerned, and not just in the US, but actually all around the world. And there's an adage that when American markets sneeze, everybody else catches a cold. And I think in the modern era, with other large markets like China coming to the fore, that doesn't apply as much as it did perhaps in previous eras, but it is still very important. The US market is the largest economy in the world, and certainly as an import market, it is far and away the largest market in the world. So, American consumers' ability to buy things is something that really matters to everybody else's economy. And this question of the tax cuts, particularly for ordinary people, the difference between a 10% tax rate and a 15% tax rate is an absolutely enormous matter as far as the American economy is concerned.
Yeah, of course. And when it comes to their spending power, like the FTSE here, of course, closed now for New Year, reopens, I think, on Wednesday. But what could this mean for the UK? Are we over-egging the pudding, or would we be in for a shock?
I think it would have an effect on the UK. The US is a very important market to the UK economy, probably to a greater extent than many other economies in Europe, for example. But we're also very heavily dependent on Europe here. And Europe has very significant problems as well. So this is sort of problems upon problems. And that is why people are very, very worried about it.
And you head up a think tank. Your job is to do the thinking for other people. It does seem an extraordinary situation, doesn't it, that the world's biggest economy has politicians still trying to come up with what looks likely to be a stopgap solution to a problem they've had, well, certainly as far as 2011, when they kicked it into the long grass back to here. It's astonishing, isn't it?
Rachel, I completely agree. And one of the things that we look into a great deal is something that we call long finance, which is trying to take a longer-term look at the commercial world and at economics and at finance. And the problems that people are trying to sort out all around the world are actually long-term problems, which is why, in a way, I don't consider the fiscal cliff to be that significant a matter, because we are in a long-term problematic period in the Western economies. And whatever happens today, whether there is a solution or not a short-term solution today, the longer-term problem is that growth is very difficult to achieve in Western economies, and all of these Western economies are in budget deficit. The difference between the fiscal cliff and not fiscal cliff is roughly, sorry to throw numbers in, but the difference between 650 billion deficit for US next year and something like 1.15 trillion. So it's $500 million different, but it is still the difference between a massive deficit and an even more massive budget deficit.
Yeah.
And just to achieve reasonable levels, or what people consider to be reasonable levels of growth, America has to look at that level of budget deficit, and every European country is in the same position.
They are, and those figures are mind-bogglingly huge, aren't they? But there is a specific problem, isn't there, on Capitol Hill, and isn't that at the moment the system seems to be broken in the sense that there remains deadlock. Obama may have control, of course, of the White House, but Senate and the House, one's Democrat, one's Republican. That gives him enormous problems in trying to do anything about this.
I agree with you, but I've been around and following American politics for several decades now, and for most of the time that I've been following American politics, this has been the case one way or the other. It is very rare, actually, for a president to be in control of both houses. And some would say, this might be a slightly cynical view, Rachel, but some would say that actually the deadlock that you tend to get on Capitol Hill, or the checks and balances, as the Founding Fathers would have described it, is actually one of the very good things about US politics. It actually stops US politics from being too extreme. However, there are occasions when deadlocks really need to be broken, or else you are at risk of a serious problem. And this is one of them. Perhaps not a cliff, but still a really serious problem that I think the public and the markets need to see, that American politicians can get together when they need to and come up with some sort of a solution to a problem like this to stop the situation from getting too bad.
Yeah, the American public desperate for that. I suppose at least it stops US politics from being dull, doesn't it? But for now, Ian Harris, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Police in Northern Ireland say an officer and his family were about to drive to Sunday lunch together when a car bomb was discovered under their vehicle. Anti-terrorism police use a robot to defuse the device, which was found on Upper Newtownards Road in East Belfast. It's been blamed on